This isn't a theory anymore. At exactly 3:47 p.m. on Monday, February 2nd, 2026, President Trump appeared on Dan Bongino's podcast and said the words that constitutional scholars are calling the most dangerous threat to American democracy since the Civil War. The Republicans should say, we want to take over, we should take over the voting in at least many 15 places. The Republicans ought to nationalize the voting. This wasn't campaign rhetoric or political posturing. This was a sitting president openly calling for the federal government to seize control of state-run elections just 9 months before the 2026 midterms. Within 24 hours, Trump doubled down from the Oval Office, surrounded by Republican lawmakers, declaring that the federal government should get involved and that if states can't count the votes legally and honestly, then somebody else should take over. America is witnessing the systematic dismantling of 250 years of constitutional election law, and it's happening in broad daylight. The constitutional crisis began the moment Trump spoke those words to former FBI Deputy Director Dan Bongino. For the first time in American history, a sitting president was openly advocating for federal seizure of election administration from the states. The Constitution explicitly grants states primary authority over elections, with Article 1, Section 4, making clear that states shall prescribe the times, places, and manner of holding elections. Nowhere does the document grant the president any authority over election administration. As constitutional law professor Barry Burden noted, this would upend 250 years of American electoral tradition and long-standing Republican opposition to the idea. Trump wasn't just violating constitutional norms, he was proposing to destroy the fundamental structure of American democracy. Trump's targeting of specific locations revealed the partisan nature of his federal takeover plan. During his Oval Office comments the next day, he specifically named Detroit, Philadelphia, and Atlanta as places with what he alleged were rigged, crooked elections. These aren't random cities. They're Democratic strongholds with large minority populations that Trump lost decisively in 2020. Jonathan Karl of ABC News observed that there isn't a great grand strategy here, but he's talking about some sense of a federal takeover of the way the elections are run, and again, primarily exclusively focusing on places that he lost in 2020. This was naked partisan manipulation disguised as election reform, an attempt to use federal power to override Democratic outcomes in cities that refuse to support Trump. The immediate reaction from constitutional experts was one of alarm and disbelief. Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer took to the Senate floor within hours, declaring, "Does Donald Trump need a copy of the Constitution? What he is saying is outlandishly illegal." Senator Ed Markey announced plans to introduce a resolution denouncing Trump's statements, emphasizing that there is no clause in the Constitution or law on the books, none that allows a president to commandeer state election systems, no emergency power, no implied authority, no because I say so. Even Trump's own Republican congressional leadership distanced themselves from the proposal. Senate Majority Leader John Thune bluntly told reporters, "I'm not in favor of federalizing elections," while House Speaker Mike Johnson deflected questions by trying to tie Trump's comments to existing legislation rather than endorsing federal takeover. Behind the public statements, the Trump administration has already begun implementing a comprehensive strategy to federalize election control through multiple government agencies. The Department of Justice has sued 24 states plus Washington, D.C., demanding access to complete voter registration databases, including sensitive information like partial Social Security numbers and dates of birth. This represents an unprecedented federal demand for state voter information that goes far beyond what's typically shared. States including California, Oregon, and Michigan have successfully fought these demands in federal court, with judges ruling that states aren't required to provide such comprehensive voter data to the federal government. But the administration continues filing new lawsuits and appealing adverse rulings, indicating a sustained campaign to acquire state election data by any means necessary. Attorney General Pam Bondi has escalated the federal pressure campaign through direct threats to state officials. In a warning letter to Minnesota Governor Tim Walz, Bondi demanded the state provide voter rolls, explicitly linking compliance to federal immigration enforcement actions. The letter suggested that providing voter data would help ease unrest in the state that stemmed from a federal immigration crackdown. Democrats immediately recognized this as extortion, with Senator Chris Murphy calling it a pretext for Trump to take over elections in swing states. The message to Democratic governors was clear: comply with federal election demands or face enhanced federal enforcement actions in your state. The administration's election interference efforts extend beyond data collection to active monitoring of state elections. The Department of Justice has deployed federal monitors to oversee elections in California and New Jersey, ostensibly to ensure compliance with federal voting rights laws. However, California Governor Gavin Newsom warned that these monitoring efforts are designed to create pretexts for challenging Democratic victories. They are creating the pretext that after we're successful with Prop 50, after there is a Democratic governor in New Jersey, that they can suggest somehow these were fraudulent, these elections were rigged against them, Newsom explained. This is a preview of 2026. Wake up, everybody. The presence of federal agents at polling places in Democratic states represents an escalation toward direct federal intervention in state election processes. Intelligence agencies have been weaponized to support Trump's election takeover agenda through investigations designed to validate his false claims about 2020 fraud. Director of National Intelligence Tulsi Gabbard made an unexplained trip to investigate election systems in Georgia, while the FBI conducted raids on election facilities in Fulton County. These actions represent an unprecedented use of federal intelligence resources to interfere with state election administration. As one Democratic official noted, Trump is using the full powers of the federal government, the FBI, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, and other people in the Justice Department to suck up information to try and confirm the debunked theories he has about the 2020 election. The legal framework Trump is using to justify federal election takeover relies on expansive interpretations of presidential emergency powers and creative readings of existing federal election laws. Voting rights advocates have identified a concerning pattern where Trump allies are sowing doubt in elections, installing loyalists in government, using doubt sowed to push an emergency, and changing election rules. The Trump administration has embedded operatives from the Election Integrity Network, a group founded by Cleta Mitchell, who was present during Trump's infamous call to Georgia officials demanding they find enough votes to overturn his 2020 loss. These operatives are now in positions to influence federal election policy from within government agencies. State resistance to Trump's federalization efforts has created a constitutional confrontation that threatens to escalate beyond legal challenges. Democratic governors and attorneys general in swing states understand they're on the front lines of defending democratic elections. Michigan Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson successfully fought federal demands for voter data, arguing that the federal government wasn't entitled to 7 million voters' personal information. Oregon and California have similarly prevailed in federal court. However, the administration's continued legal appeals and new lawsuit filings suggest they're prepared for a prolonged battle that could extend through the 2026 elections. Republican-controlled states have largely cooperated with federal data demands, creating a two-tier system where red states comply while blue states resist. Texas, Alabama, and Mississippi were among several states to reach memoranda of understanding that led them to hand over comprehensive voter information to the Justice Department. This partisan divide in compliance reinforces the political nature of Trump's election federalization campaign. Red states are voluntarily surrendering voter data while blue states fight federal demands in court, creating exactly the kind of differential treatment that Trump can use to justify further federal intervention. The broader implications of Trump's election takeover extend far beyond the 2026 midterms to threaten the fundamental structure of American federalism. If successful, this would represent the most significant shift in federal-state relations since Reconstruction. The decentralized nature of American elections has been a crucial safeguard against manipulation and fraud precisely because it makes systematic interference nearly impossible. As one expert noted, the highly decentralized system used in the U.S. makes it exceptionally difficult for a bad actor such as a foreign adversary or a group wanting to rig an election to do so. Federal control would create a single target for manipulation and eliminate the protective redundancy that has safeguarded American democracy for centuries. Congressional oversight has been largely absent as Trump implements his election takeover strategy. The razor-thin Republican majority in Congress has shown little appetite for confronting the executive branch over constitutional violations. Oversight hearings have been episodic rather than sustained, while key committees avoid examining the administration's unprecedented use of federal power against state election systems. This congressional inaction represents a fundamental failure of the separation of powers at precisely the moment when constitutional checks and balances are most needed. The Supreme Court's silence on Trump's election federalization efforts is equally concerning. Despite clear constitutional questions about federal versus state authority over elections, the court has not moved to define limits or signal that boundaries exist around federal interference with state election systems. This judicial passivity enables Trump's continuing expansion of federal election control while leaving state officials uncertain about what legal protections they can rely on when resisting federal demands. Trump's claims about non-citizen voting provide the pretext for his federal takeover, despite experts consistently noting that such instances are incredibly rare and already illegal under federal law. Voter roll audits leading up to the 2024 election uncovered very few instances of non-citizen registration, undermining Trump's narrative of widespread fraud requiring federal intervention. However, the administration continues to use these debunked claims to justify unprecedented federal actions against state election systems. Hans von Spakovsky of the conservative Advancing American Freedom Group acknowledged that voter rolls are a central focus ahead of the midterms because of the Trump administration's concerns that non-citizens are on them and could end up voting, despite the lack of evidence supporting such concerns. The timing of Trump's election federalization push is strategically designed to maximize disruption of the 2026 midterms while minimizing time for legal challenges to be resolved. By announcing federal takeover plans just 9 months before elections, Trump creates a compressed timeline that makes comprehensive judicial review difficult. State officials must simultaneously prepare for elections while fighting federal lawsuits and resisting administrative pressure campaigns. This creates exactly the kind of chaos and uncertainty that can be used to justify further federal intervention under emergency powers. International observers have noted parallels between Trump's election federalization strategy and tactics used by authoritarian leaders to consolidate power in other countries. The pattern of questioning election integrity, installing loyalists in key positions, and using manufactured crises to justify emergency powers follows well-documented playbooks for democratic backsliding. America's allies are watching with concern as fundamental democratic institutions come under attack from within the federal government itself. The economic implications of election uncertainty are already becoming apparent as businesses and investors worry about political stability. Markets function best under predictable legal frameworks, but Trump's assault on election law creates uncertainty about basic democratic processes. If Americans lose confidence in election integrity because of federal interference, the resulting political instability could have significant economic consequences extending well beyond the 2026 election cycle. State election officials are preparing for unprecedented federal interference while trying to maintain normal election administration. This dual responsibility places enormous strain on state and local governments that must simultaneously resist federal overreach while ensuring voters can participate in democratic processes. The psychological toll on election workers who already face threats and harassment is compounded by federal agencies treating them as potential criminals rather than public servants protecting democracy. Trump's election federalization represents the culmination of his long-standing refusal to accept democratic outcomes that don't favor him. From claiming he won the 2020 election despite losing by over 7 million votes to now proposing federal seizure of election administration, Trump has consistently prioritized his personal power over democratic institutions. The progression from questioning results to demanding federal control represents a fundamental escalation that threatens not just individual elections but the entire framework of American democracy. The 2026 midterms will serve as a crucial test of whether American democratic institutions can withstand direct federal assault. With Trump openly advocating for federal takeover of state elections, Democratic control of key governorships and Secretary of State positions in swing states becomes not just politically important but constitutionally essential. These state officials may be the last line of defense against federal election interference designed to ensure Republican victories regardless of voter preferences. As November approaches, Americans face the unprecedented prospect of federal agents monitoring polling places, federal lawsuits challenging state election procedures, and a president who has openly declared his intention to take over elections that don't produce results he likes. The constitutional crisis Trump warned about during his first term has arrived, but not in the form his supporters expected. Instead of protecting election integrity, Trump is using federal power to undermine it. The question is no longer whether Trump will attempt to federalize elections, but whether American institutions will be strong enough to stop him from destroying the democratic system that brought him to power.